Alrighty, great. Back again. This time we're probably going to conclude Gilles Deleuze's Cinema 2, The Time Image. And if you're tuning into this one without looking at the other ones or listening to the other ones, please go back and listen to at least part 1 and 2 of this one. And to get a real full understanding, jump back to Cinema 1, The Movement Image, which we've covered. That is me and Christina, who's been extremely helpful in helping me understand this. And Christina, who are you?
So I'm Christina Elle Burke. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Study in Theory and Criticism at Western University. I do screenwriting. I do all kinds of creative writing. I'm currently working on a dissertation of some kind. And I won an award for my cinema writings from the Film Studies Association of Canada for an essay on a concept I made up called cineroticism. So yeah, I'm very familiar with film stuff, and Cinema 2 is, if you listen to the previous episodes, I called it my favorite book, next to William Faulkner's Light in August. So yeah, I feel like this book speaks to me in a certain way. I'm maybe the one person equipped to understand all of it.
Yeah, because I'm not. So yeah, all right, great. And we're going to start here from Chapter 7, Thought and Cinema.
Yeah, where I got my new Twitter handle.
Right, what is it again? You didn't plug it.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It's Thought and Cinema, THOT and Cinema. So, yeah, little pun there. Okay, this is the big chapter. I feel like this is the to borrow a phrase from pro wrestling, the granddaddy of them all. This is it. This is where we are now going to talk about how films think. Who is it that does the thinking when we watch a film? Where their power or lack thereof comes from and what it's for. Who the great contemporary directors are. It's all going to come from thinking about this. And he's gone over some of them already, but they'll be recapitulated. So the important first concept is, if you remember when we were talking about Cinema 1, I spoke about the kind of vagueness of Deleuze's cinema subject. That is to say, who the viewer is in Deleuze's thought.
Okay.
And he gives us some sort of ideas. He talks about in Cinema 1 the brain as interval. Here he talks about sort of time as thought and the pure past, and sort of learning to describe what we're being shown. But the true subject is what he begins to articulate in this chapter. The subject of cinema for Deleuze, taking the concept from a very obscure French art historian named Jean-Louis Schaeffer's book on cinema, is the spiritual automaton. And so what is a spiritual automaton?
Christina, please let us know.
It is a automatic response that exists within us that the cinema attempts to call upon. It is almost a dualism in the sense that, like, Descartes will make a distinction between the soul and the body, while the cinema will produce in us a spiritual automaton outside of our brains who responds to its powers. And this is very strange and science fictional and a bizarre approach to subjectivity, to say cinema creates these subjects within us or summons them or makes them known. So how does it do this? How do we awaken the spiritual automaton? And why is it an automaton? Like, why is it this sort of generic subject and not something fuller? And so in the first chapter of chapter 7, he talks about the spiritual automaton in relation to the movement image and how it is summoned by this idea of a shock. And if you've read Benjamin or or you've read Adorno, the idea of the shock is very key to their ideas of modern art, that there is something in film, according to Benjamin, that snaps us out of our ordinary perception and calls upon us to look at the world in a different way. And so this is the shock that awakens the spiritual automaton, that awakens this thinker in us. And Deleuze is somewhat sort of critical here of like Benjamin and Bella Balatz and other early cinema theorists for what they thought this shock could do. Because now we look back and go, it wasn't that transformative. It maybe changed their perception a little bit, but it didn't alter the course of history. It didn't liberate us, this shock. Nevertheless, Eisenstein was the one to really put this into theoretical practice. Like his ideas of the dialectics of cinema, this spiral of man and nature man overcoming and emerging out of nature in conflict with nature. This is how he saw film as summoning you to think, was with these moments of collision and these moments of shock that were made up of intellectual components. And this is also where we get the first idea of an intellectual cinema, a cinema that summons you to think through its associations. And so after this sort of Eisenstein, we move into Hitchcock, and Hitchcock is when things sort of start breaking down. The shock goes away, and instead of shock, we have suspense. And so it's no longer a jolt that cinema provides, but kind of a tension. And this tension sort of inaugurates an era of reflection, but not the reflection that will happen in the time image. It's still subordinated to movement, to action. Suspense pays off. We don't just linger in it indefinitely. If we did, then it would become a time image. So that's where the spiritual automaton emerges in the movement image, and it's tied to movement, and it's active, it's shocked into motion, it's brought to life. And so in the next section, he turns to an old Deleuze favorite for readers of The Logic of Sense, though he mentions him elsewhere, Antonin Artaud. And the idea that in the powerlessness of thought, the failure of thought, what thought cannot think, there is a greater power. And so this is what the time image is going to do for us. It asks us to surrender our ability to act in order so that we may go further and find new ways of looking at things. And so we realize that it is only by letting go of our capacity to act that we encounter something beyond us. And so how do we let go rationally? You don't. It can't be something rational. This is the point of his reference to Kierkegaard and the absurd, that you can't think your way to the renewal of thought. You can't think your way into faith and truth. You have to just believe. And so what cinema does, what this new cinema does, is return a form of belief to this automaton figure. That what it asks us to do and awaken in ourselves is the ability to let go and say, by not acting, by not thinking according to these sensory motor reflexes, we will find something more powerful. And so the power of cinema becomes the power to believe in the world. And so, what is this? What is it that we believe in? Because it's not just a blind faith. It is a belief in our power to endlessly create the world. The world is always an invention, and it is always made by giving over to the powers that thought itself hasn't realized yet. And so when Deleuze asks us to believe in this world, what he's asking us to believe in is our power to create and our creativity.
And this is the Deleuze I know.
Yeah.
You know, the 1,000 Plateaus, Anti-Oedipus Deleuze, the Deleuze of possibility, you know, deterritorialization in the good sense, not the capitalist sense. Like, this is where it started to make sense to me. And there's this quote where he says that the cinema must film, not the world, but belief in this world, our only link. The nature of the cinematographic illusion has often been considered. Restoring our belief in the world, this is the power of modern cinema. Which is where I think captures the essence of this.
Yes, and speaking of essence, you know, now we're here, where Deleuze kept teasing us with that Nietzsche quote that the essence of something doesn't reveal itself at the beginning, but in the middle of its lifetime. So I think that's another reason he takes the Second World War as a breaking point. It is, by the position of 1983 or 1985 or whenever he started writing these books, the middle of the history of cinema, literally. Obviously now that's different. Time has gone on. We would put the line in a different place. But when he was writing, that was the middle. And so we need to become, speaking of 1,000 Plateaus, there is sort of an element of becoming imperceptible here. The Schaeffer's idea of the ordinary man of cinema is very much a man without qualities, who is in the world but not a part of it and sees it from this outside position. And so that's going to get us into the third section, where he starts explicitly using the phrase the thought of the outside, which he takes from Foucault's writings on Blanchot. I don't remember if Blanchot ever explicitly uses the term thought of the outside. But he talks about the outside and the absolutely outside. And it's also in this third section that he's going to talk about the distinction between problems and theorems. So theorems are prescriptive. They are sensory motor. They give us answers. Problems are general. We live in problems. We do not find an answer to them. They create possibilities. Problems here seem very much to me to be like ideas in difference and repetition, where the idea is sort of a pure multiplicity. And it's the same with the problem. The problem is a space of multiplicity where there are no sort of definitive answers. And he really gets into this idea of the whole is the outside. So in Cinema 1, we were constantly hitting the phrase, the whole is the open.
Yeah.
So that the whole referred to a totality of parts that were constantly changing and influencing one another, but they all existed together, whereas now we have a whole where what it is influenced is what is outside of it, alien to it. What makes it is not what's within it, but what is outside it. So this is the unthought in thought, or the impower of thought, its ability to say, what is not a part of me, I can accept it and bring it in and create something new. So now the whole produces newness. And one of the ways this outside is touched upon is through his idea of the interstice. And I'm going to be a little, I'm going to toot my own horn. My entire MA thesis is about the idea of the interstice. and how it relates to the work of Jean-Luc Godard. And so if you're interested, I'd recommend looking up Tracing the Interstice, Godard, Deleuze, and the Future of Cinema.
I could probably put a link for it.
Yeah.
If,
It has my dead name on it, which I couldn't get changed, which is really unfortunate. But,
really?
Yeah. Nonetheless, I think if you're interested just in the interstice as a concept and what it means, I would recommend that. And so he brings up Godard here as the sort of emblematic thinker of the interstice, because Godard famously began to incorporate black frames into his work, specifically in the 1970s. And so these were literally interstitial frames, interruptions, things of that nature. So to answer a question from, I think it was the previous episode, who was the Deleuze of cinema? It's
right.
Godard.
Godard.
Deleuze sees him and Godard as engaged in a very similar thing, especially when he talks about Godard's use of categories and how not only are the genres Godard slides between categories, but colors become categories, characters become categories, music becomes a category. It's always this shifting between all these different types of things and these endless reference that are pushed to their limit and collapsed, and this is what Deleuze does. It's the same thing, like with these books themselves. He is taking all these films and pushing the idea of what cinema is to its limits wherever he can with his examples, and he's trying to exhaust them and be like, these are the concepts that come from them. So for Deleuze, or Deleuze's mirror image in cinema as he sees it is Godard. Of course, when someone asks Godard about Deleuze, he's going to say, I don't know, structuralists write badly. Godard is not the biggest fan of Deleuze.
Sure.
He doesn't... He just... I think Godard is much... As his recent films testify, he does believe in a language of the image, which Deleuze disavows constantly throughout this book.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's like watching mommy and daddy fight. And it's just like, I love you both, shut up.
Which one's daddy?
Godard is always daddy. And yeah, so Godard sort of is emblematic of a contemporary intellectual cinema, and I think this is still true today when people want to make fun of artsy films, like what they're likely referencing. If it's not Bergman, it's Godard. Like, that is our idea of pretension, is like French people smoking a lot of cuts, not understanding what's going on. Like, yeah, I think Godard is still our model for intellectual cinema, and when he dies, maybe intellectual cinema will die with him. Who's to say?
Mm-hmm.
God, I'm going to be a mess when that happens.
What were some of his films?
So his 60s films are very famous. Breathless, A Woman is a Woman, Vivre sa vie, Alphaville, Weekend, Masculine Feminine. These are all tremendous films I can't recommend enough. Perrault Le Fou is very crucial to Deleuze's discussion, and it is really a turning point in Godard's early oeuvre. And then in the 70s, he made political films as part of the Giga Vertov group with Jean-Pierre Gorin. And then he started making films in Switzerland with his partner, Anne-Marie Mieville. And then he returned to France in the 80s, made some feature films that were very different from his 60s films, because he really undergoes a shift from using sort of like pop culture references and kind of like a pop art aesthetic to switching to more like classical references and like more canon sort of aesthetics. And so people were very much like, oh, this is too smart for me now. Those older films were fun. Why don't you make movies like the old fun ones? And he's always going to do his own thing, and he's still making movies in Switzerland. And he's still doing crazy interviews with Cahiers du Cinema where he talks about langage and doesn't like traditional film reviews because they don't show you what happens between the images. And
Jesus.
Godard is Godard. He is.
There's something to love about him because you're drawn to him.
Yeah, I really am. Like a moth to a flame. Okay, so Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. Cinema, Body and Brain, Thought.
Yeah. Okay, so we now know where our power for thinking is coming from. It's coming from our what we don't think about, what we cannot think. So that means if we're going to think with the body, we are thinking with the body not in terms of what we can order it to do, but what it can become. The postures it can take on. The jest is the term he borrows from Brecht, a particular gesture, a tableau, a posture. Deleuze has this really great essay on Beckett in Essays Critical and Clinical. I think it's The Exhausted or something like that, where he...
No idea.
He talks about these postures of fatigue in Beckett, and so these are also jests in the way that he talks about in cinema. And so he has the quote from Spinoza, "We don't even know what a body can do." And it's because we tie it into these sensory motor mechanisms. So what does the body become when it's sort of set loose to think for itself, in a way? And so he talks about John Cassavetes, an American director who did a lot of improvisation in making his films. He was very interested in postures, particularly that women take up. His close collaborator and long-term partner, Gina Rowlands, was a huge part of that. She really shapes the Cassavetes oeuvre, but not her exclusively. He made other films without her. Similar principles. Because it's improvised, because it's so theatrical, but also because the stories are not. They're not about what the characters want. They're about the situations they find themselves in. They take up postures that are unfamiliar or strange. And of course, he talks about new wave directors, and Godard is one of them. Godard gets placed with the cinema of the body, which I would maybe like, Godard's everything. Okay, body, brain, like... But yes, in the early Godard films, and even in like slow motion, which Deleuze talks about, there is very much a sense of how are bodies organized, how are they being organized, what forces get to organize them, how do they resist. And then finally he talks a lot about Philippe Gerrell, who is a very obscure figure. He started off making silent films in the 1960s as part of a film collective post-1968 called the Zanzibar Group, who were basically radical experimental filmmakers in their teens and early 20s who were trying to sort of like, what is a new cinema? What can we make with the little things we have? And so Gerrell's early works are these very strange films like Le Revelator, which is about a child walking down a hallway, and there's images of him with his family, and there's like familial conflict, and Deleuze talks about like the Joseph, Mary, and the child imagery, and it's a very strange cinema, but it's a cinema that comes out of the new wave. I would say it's post-new wave, but it is so fascinated by these gestures because it is silent, because I'm not sure if they didn't have the budget to shoot in sound or they just didn't want to. He has this film called The High Solitudes, or Les Hautes Solitudes. And it is, on the one hand, a like silent documentary about Jean Seberg, this American actress who made her career in France after starring in Godard's Breathless. And you can't tell if it's the most intrusive thing in the world, because you just see her in these moments of total weakness and panic and mania. But but you can always tell that, like, this is being crafted, this is being captured. Is she acting? Is she not? Like, these gestures, these postures, like, did Gerrell capture her at her most vulnerable and took advantage of her wanting to stay relevant? Or was it that she welcomed him in and gave him this performance? Like, we never know. We're constantly moving between these things, and as a result, she creates these movements and these gestures and characters that are so strange, and they serve no purpose whatsoever. The film just captures her as she is, or as she wants to appear. It's not clear. So I can see why Gerrell is so important to this idea, even though in terms of like English language film reception, nobody knows who he is. Who wants to watch silent films made in the late 60s and early 70s? Like, yeah. Okay, so the next section. Give me a brain then. So this is a new idea of thinking the brain. And he talks about this. Our classic idea of the brain is that, like, it's a thinking thing, it's directed, it's intentional, etc. And Deleuze talks about how, well, we have a new idea of the brain. This new brain is sort of a-centered. It's actually all these different networks connecting together. It's not like an organized totality. It's actually all these disparate sort of sensation shocks, membranes all together. And it is like a topological space. It's probabilistic, but it's not rational. It can short circuit. It can do things that we didn't think it could do, or it can come to conclusions that don't just follow from the obvious information it's given. And so the two filmmakers he uses are Stanley Kubrick, who was probably welcome for you because you're like, I've seen Kubrick movies.
I have seen Kubrick movies. I like Kubrick a lot.
Yeah, and did you recognize Kubrick and what he was saying?
No
or
idea.
Were you just like, no?
Not a clue. He's talking about. He doesn't even name Hal. He's like the big computer.
Oh yeah, you definitely forgot. You just forgot the name of it.
It's like, yeah, but yeah, no, I like Kubrick. So
yeah, so we see this in Kubrick and René. René especially is the example he really goes in on of these thinking spaces where different possibilities are taken into consideration. I'm trying to think of... So in René's film My American Uncle, it starts off with an explanation by this... I think he's like a neuroscientist, but he's talking about rats and how rats are determined by these courses of like patterns in their brain. And then the story is actually about these three people, and it compares them to the rats and like the way they respond to things. So it's very much like this kind of funny, but also like sort of film about like probabilities and chance and time and how things work out and what someone could be if like one thing went just a little bit differently. And so this kind of way of framing things for Deleuze is very much like this is the contemporary idea of the brain. It's not something complete in itself. It has to take in all these possibilities and is shaped by what is outside it. Different from the body, which is, about posture, the brain is about probability, I think. So In the last section, he starts talking about sort of third world cinema and minor languages. I don't know if you've read the Kafka book.
No,
Guattari wrote. No, neither have I. But that's where they come up with the idea of sort of the minor and minor languages.
You had a bit of it in 1,000 Plateaus, too.
Yeah, I think it's in there as well. And sort of what these films do is they give the power of the speech act to these repressed peoples. And they give voices to languages and people of those languages who are excluded from dominant discourses. And the film I kept thinking of while reading this section wasn't actually one that he mentioned because he couldn't have, but it's one I watched recently, and that's the Taiwanese director Hou Hsiao-hsien's City of Sadness.
I haven't seen it.
So City of Sadness takes place immediately after the Second World War and during the Communist Revolution in China, where the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek retreats to Taiwan and sort of occupies Taiwan. And so Taiwan falls under martial law. And throughout the film, there is this sense that the Taiwanese people who existed before occupation by the Chinese, who were occupied by the Japanese, and who also speak their own languages, we see a history kind of their erasure, but also of their resistance. The film itself is an act of resistance by depicting this event. So there are all these competing languages in the film. There's Japanese, there's Chinese, and then there's Taiwanese. And so by displaying this sort of historical silencing, Ho brings life to Taiwanese culture and its place as a minor culture between two sort of imperial powers in Japan and China. And I think it's very similar to the way Deleuze and Guattari talk about not only Kafka but also Beckett as an Irish writer, or Joyce, sort of trying to respond between English and French and trying to find a place there for himself out of those languages. So I think City of Sadness is a really interesting example. But the films Deleuze talks about too, the African films of, specifically the Senegalese films of Ousmane Sembène, the Brazilian films of Glauber Rocha, these films also do these things in different ways. Like Sembène's films tend to be comedies. Rocha made, God, they're like half Western, half musicals. They're astounding to look at, and it's like, why aren't these films like restored and available? Like, this is an incredible example of Brazilian cinema. Like, but anyway, it's beside the point. And he also talks about Perrault and the Quebecois again here. So, speaking of speaking, Chapter 9.
Chapter 9.
Is
the components of the image.
Yeah. This is going to be all about talking.
I'm glad I've been able to participate by saying out the chapter titles.
Mm-hmm.
To reiterate, I'm a noob, but it's ironic because my undergrad was technically in film, or at least that was a part of it.
Yeah,
Hence my watching Bicycle Thieves, 8.5.
Yeah.
Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and, they're Hitchcock and Wells.
Yeah, my undergrad was definitely film-based as well, but I was in what I've come to learn was a very strange film program because they paired us with art history. Most film programs these days seem to be paired with English.
Yeah, that's what I was. I was English.
So I feel like I got this interesting perspective where I was viewing film more in relation to painting and the plastic arts and not so much in relation to literature. So I never necessarily put the storytelling always first. So that's why when Deleuze is going to speak to me about a taxonomy of images, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm down for this. Let's do that.
Yeah. Totally alien to me.
Yeah.
Totally alien.
So speaking of the Speech Act, he's gonna recapitulate for us. He often does. So we're gonna go back to silent cinema, and we're gonna talk about what the sound was like in silent cinema. And so, speech in silent cinema is communicated through intertitles. So it's something that is both visible and read. It's part of the image, and it's part of the scene. The sound in silent films is like additional. It's added on. It's outside. And then when speech becomes, or when the films become talkative, or they become the talkie, that's the term Deleuze uses. I always thought talkie was kind of a silly term, but
yeah.
Anyway, I digress. Then we start to be able to read the image separately from speech, but we also still see the speech as well as part of the image. So it's still sensory motor, just as the intertitles corresponded to action. The new talking also corresponds to action, so it's directed. But there is also this element of conversation, and I found his discussion of conversation really like fun, because it's just like, the power of conversation and the American comedies, and like how it's all about conversing and who has the power in the conversation, and who's sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Subjected, who's like in the weaker position in the
What examples did he give here for this?
He talks about like Hawks' screwball comedies, like Bringing Up Baby, and
right.
Yeah,
I've seen
His
that
Girl
one.
Friday.
I haven't seen that. I've seen
His Girl
Bringing Up
Friday
Baby.
is really good, but so is Bringing Up Baby. They're both really good.
What about like Some Like It Hot?
Yeah, that'd be good too. Like the Capra films. Yeah, I think he mentions Capra
Maybe
there too. I don't. Memory's bad at this point. But yeah, so this talking sort of shows us that the image has the capability to be read, but we read it in relation to the conversation, and they're sort of complementary to one another. And then there's this next section on film music, which I really didn't understand. Honestly, there's one part of this book that gets me, the film music section. I'll do my best. So in the movement image, film music can either provide an accompaniment or a counterpoint, so it can synthesize with the action in sort of a Hegelian way, or it can testify to a certain outside force that underlies the image in, I guess, kind of a Nietzschean, Dionysian way.
Sure.
I've always found the whole music part of The Birth of Tragedy to be somewhat impenetrable, I'm not gonna lie.
Oh, really? Okay, that's too bad, because that's like the biggest part of it.
Is it?
I think so.
It's the subtitle, but I feel like most of the time he's like, representation and chaos, and you got one, you got the other.
For me, it always just comes back to music. When I think of Dionysian, I'm just thinking the music. I'm thinking the like Gorgon chant of like.
Oh, see, I'm thinking of like the chorus in like the most literal, like the Greek chorus, who aren't really musical. They're just like a character.
Sure.
But yeah, that's totally fair, and actually probably works better here that there is that kind of musical force that can be summoned up to, like, yeah, work not necessarily with the image, but to be channeled by it and part of it underneath it. And then, yeah, whenever there's off-screen sound or off-screen speech, it's always part of what we're seeing in the movement image. Like, it's always, sound off-screen implies a space where that sound came from in the movement image. So in the time image, sound and image are going to separate. And so we're finally at son signs. Most of the things we've been talking about, op signs. We're finally at son signs.
Right. For the last 10 pages.
Yeah. Any sound, whatever. So what happens here is that images and sounds don't necessarily have anything to do with one another anymore. And the strobe Huillet films, he just refers to them as strobe films, but they were collaborators, and they shared an equal part of the work. It was Strobe Huillet, Jean-Marie Strobe and his wife Danielle Huillet, not just one of them. Their film Too Early, Too Late, to use an example, in the first part of the film, we see these French villages, just images of these French villages, like fields, towns, squares, things like that. And the voiceover is reciting to us, I think it's messages from French revolutionaries from the turn of the century. So that is the sound we hear, is this Marxist revolutionary sort of speech, but we just see images of cities and fields. And the chronology doesn't add up. It's not like the image is being made to look like when this sound would have come from. So we're tasked with, what does the image mean? What do we make of these images? But also, what do we make of the sound? What does the sound mean? It's become sound for itself. It's become sound on its own. It's become any sound, whatever. And if there's a relationship between them, if they form a whole, it's not a whole in which they both take part. It is a whole in which they both open onto and into one another, and so are outside one another. So we get what he calls a stratigraphic image. That is to say, again, it's a question of depth. The image itself takes on a depth of meaning. And so there's this kind of, I guess, sort of spectral implication in these works, that these spaces are sort of haunted, that there's something buried there, something that we're not seeing. It's not just arbitrary, it's not like surreal, it's very much a self-consciously political gesture that they're going after. And so this shows us the pure op sign and the pure son sign and how they sort of go together. And he talks about how this could be television.
Okay, yeah.
He's like, TV could do this. TV has the power to produce these images, but TV always just goes back to the most banal form of presentation. It's not going to do this.
Time is money.
Yeah. So, but when someone like Godard is paid to make something for TV, he will bring all his crazy sound mixing techniques. He will bring his black frames. He will bring his style to television and show that television can communicate this way, that it doesn't have to be the other way. And he will bring this disjunction, this depth to television. And I think Deleuze really responds to Godard's TV works. Maybe just because Deleuze didn't like leaving his house. But he has a separate essay on Godard's Six fois deux, which was a television production that, to be honest, I have not read. But I know Deleuze was really into Godard's television stuff. Okay. So chapter 10.
The conclusion. Did it have a title? It's just conclusion.
I think it's just conclusion.
Conclusion.
Okay, so chapter 10 is going to point outwards, but then end up in maybe a little bit of a disappointing place.
I'm excited.
So the first section, we finally get to talk about electronic images. And I vastly prefer the concept of the electronic image to the digital image, because electronic images encapsulate both television and computers, whether analog or digital, in a way that I think makes sense and in a way that keeps film separate. Electronic images are informational images. And Deleuze talks about the tyranny of information and the futility of information, that information is never going to do anything. And what we have is too much information. And this is going to be a big part of Deleuze's later politics when he writes the Postscript on Societies of Control. He's speaking about the glut of information and how contemporary society, writing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, is about who has access to what information. And largely our society has just become a hyper-accelerated version of this, I think. Anyway, it's still all about information. It's about who can buy information, who can sell information, the best ways to gather information, how to make everyone constantly produce information all the time. Like, it's never about really being creative. It's just about adding to this endless counting machine that's going to use it to sell you shampoo or give you a code to get a discount on a food order or something like that. Like, information has completely taken over our lives. And, like, what is the crisis of fake news if not a crisis of quote-unquote bad information? But all information, it's... The reason we can't tell the difference between fake news and real news is because it's just all at the same level of the informatic. It's... And that's where the real crisis lies, is how do we produce something more powerful than information?
Yeah, well, in Baudrillard's words, he's like, if we were to get at the heart of it, we must renounce information itself.
Yeah.
Which is they're all saying the same shit. But
yeah. Yeah, I think there's certainly a sympathy there. And what interests me is, I think, not to get all polemical, but there is a real desire to move away from the term film studies and move into either calling it film and media studies or calling it moving image studies. And I don't mean to offend you as a media studies person, but I don't think films are electronic images.
I don't think films belong in media studies.
Yeah.
Because from my experience, no one that I know in media studies is equipped to, as far as the experts that belong to the canon, are equipped to actually study film. They're prepared to study media, in very broad terms, like not... And what he gets to at the very end of this book is that cinema demands its own language. Like, it is its own language that I don't think any kind of, like, broad approach of, like, just clumping it up with other media can ever do it justice.
Yeah, and that's definitely how I feel. So this is another part of the book that really speaks to me personally, is, for me, when we talk about TV and film, TV has its own history. And you can't separate the history of television from the history of advertising.
Yeah. And that's what many, like, media theorists that actually study television do it with the intent of really studying advertising. And, like, in television, how are the audience turned into commodities themselves? Like, how are the audience the ones that are sold to? But that's not what Deleuze is interested in here. He's not interested in how audiences are turned into automatons with the cinema. In fact, he's opening up worlds or hoping that cinema might open up worlds, which media studies people are not and I'm being very reductive in what I know. Generally, they are not want to think about what, the cinema or what even television can open up. It's about how it forecloses possibility.
Yeah, and I think to me, television, A, you can't consider it separately from the history of advertising, but B, even what it's become now, you can't separate what happens on Netflix from the history of digital distribution and entertainment.
Yeah, you're just data. Like,
yeah, it's these shows that we binge watch. Some of them are great. Some of them are faux prestige. Some of them are awful. It's a various range, but they're all just kind of information too. Like it takes a lot to make of an electronic image an image of thought. Really. And it's hard to say what or if anything has achieved it. I think it's achieved it at moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd put video games also in the electronic image category. They're about inputs. And when he describes electronic screens as layering information over images and on top of images, it's like, that's what video games are. They're information layered over top of an image that corresponds to the information being presented. And so it's very interesting to me that, like, okay, if we're going to think beyond cinema, we have to dive into its relationship with the relationship of these mediums with information in a way that film isn't related.
Yeah.
That if we want to, we can speak about film in the sense of movement images and time images in terms of these autonomous images, that these other forms of media, these other electron images aren't. They don't have that same autonomy. And just to sort of point in two directions, the French film critic Serge Denay, who Deleuze talks about a bit, in the 1980s, he took up this project to start watching movies on television. So every night he'd watch a movie on a French television channel, like a classic film or an older film. And he'd, like, pay attention to the commercials they showed, pay attention to how it was cropped for TV, and be like, so what changed? Because this is different. It's not the movie as I saw it in the theater or as I saw it on a print at the Cinematheque. Like, something happened here, something changed. And then another example would be a more contemporary critic, D.N. Roderick, who very much had a crisis with digital images and digital cinematography, where he wondered if the time image could exist in digital cinematography, or if this was truly an end of cinema with the loss of celluloid film. That, like, if these images are digital images, do they retain their autonomy that they do when they're projected? Because it's easy to see a projector as sort of an autonomous image. Yes, it's mechanical, and there's an apparatus there which operates it, but the image coming out of it is all that's coming out of it. It's just the image that's produced. You know, whereas digital images are plugged into computers, they're sourced through all this information, and they become electronic. So, like, when it's not about light and exposure and things like that, and it becomes about layering information over the image, even in terms of, like, color grading, which is a form of putting information into the image as part of the filmmaking process, quote-unquote filmmaking process. Like, is this still the time image anymore? Is this still capable of offering a time image? And in his latest book, he kind of was like, I've found some, but I'm still skeptical. And so this really points towards a sort of thing that a lot of people in film studies don't like to think about, which is what we want to do even still possible? Or, like, how do we frame what we do? Because something that's always driven me nuts in the first year film classes I've TA'd is we'll have, like, our lecture hall where we screen the movie, and the professor will say something like, make sure you show up to the screenings because this is a more authentic experience. And I just sit there and I think, no, it isn't. The speakers are at the front of the room. We're playing it on a DVD player. It's just blown up by an old projector that can't even do 1080p. Like, this is... I'm sorry, this is not an authentic experience. It's a completely electronic one. Like, people watching it on their computers are not having a different experience than people watching in the lecture hall. The only people who would have a different experience is if they went and watched a 35 or 16 millimeter print of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so much of film studies is devoted to these, like, close readings of films
where we sort of pretend that it's always the same thing every time we watch it, but it's not. It changes based on how we choose and where we choose to watch it. And so, like, I'm not saying that you have to see a movie in 35mm to claim you've really seen the movie. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that there's an affective and autonomous component to film as film that changes when we begin to consume images electronically, and it should call into question our goals for film research. That was a bit ranty.
I mean, I think that was good.
Yeah, so the second part of this last chapter is just a recapitulation of the signs of the time image. So we have our chronosigns, which are our visual sort of representations of time. We have our new signs, which is the new form of shock that we experience, the irrational disjuncture, the irrational cut, things like that. And we have lectosigns, which are like images we read, descriptions, things like that. And then, of course, he talks about the audiovisual split again, and op signs and son signs being sort of freed from their sensory motor thing. And then we get to the last section, where this wasn't about film at all.
It was about philosophy, really.
Yeah, it turns out that the real question is not whether we can produce explanations for the cinema, but what the cinema can do for thought and how it can change the way we think about certain things. And so the real question we need to turn to is, what is philosophy? What is the autonomous quality of philosophy? What does philosophy do? What is philosophy's material? Because we've gone over the cinema's material. It has these two images. These images are made up of these signs. It has all these different signs. But it's not necessarily about cinema. The people who know about cinema are the people who make it.
Yeah.
And he says, like, something like psychoanalysis or linguistics are never going to be adequate to the cinema. It's never going to be able to, like, explain all these things together in one neat little system. It's just not going to happen. And I think the first time I read this last bit, I got so mad. Because I was just kind of like, how dare you? How dare you talk so much about film, have what are, in many cases, interesting insights into films, and then at the end tell me, no, that's not what it was really about. But then, you know, the more I kind of dealt with this book, and I went through a big period of resistance where I was like, well, I can make these ideas about film. Like, you can say they're not about film, but I'll make them about film. That's what my MA thesis was like, I'm going to take this idea you have and I'm going to make it about film. And then I've since come to realize that I think Deleuze is speaking from a place of, like, I don't want to tell you what to do. The cinema is perfect as it is, as long as no one comes along and ruins it. Which could be argued has happened several dozen times since he wrote these books. But like, that is his thing, is he's trying to be like, I'm a philosopher. That's what I am. And I think the cinema can help me articulate my philosophy. And so I want to leave the cinema to the people who've succeeded at it, who are the best at it. I've given you dozens upon dozens of names of those people, if you're interested. Like, but this is the question I'm trying to answer. This is the question I'm obsessed with. And so I'm a lot more softer on it. But at the same time, you know, this whole journey that Deleuze has taken us on has been framed sort of as this conspiracy and struggle, this fall from movement into cliche, and this escape into thought and the depths of thinking and its possibilities. It's been almost like a science fiction story in a way. Just as a quick aside, if you ever get around to Difference and Repetition, in one of the prefaces he says philosophy should be like a science fiction, and he quotes Samuel Butler, or he references Samuel Butler's Erewhon, but doesn't matter. He's talking about Godard's Alphaville. 100%. 100% it's just a reference to Alphaville. I see it. And so this is really Deleuze bringing his style to bear, and he's produced this bizarre history taxonomy of what cinema is and what it can do and what it's up against in the end, and like, can it really save us? And I think what Deleuze comes down to is, well, it can help, but we need to figure out this question: what is philosophy? That's the thing that's really going to help us. And it needs cinema to help us, but it's really the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there's some people who are going to, and you'll know who I'm thinking of in particular, who would just be like, philosophy's not going to save anyone. Philosophy is poison. Philosophy is always a way to control people. Like, but I think what Deleuze has tried to show is that there's another way of thinking philosophically. There's a way that positions itself to receive what exists in front of it, to believe in its possibility for transformation, and to not impose. And I think it really is a kind of both powerful sort of like creative liberation, but it's one that's not going to be finished. It's going to keep asking questions. And this is really like I compared Deleuze's cinema books to a Jacques Rivette film. Just to review, he makes movies that average around 3 hours in length. He makes very long films. There's usually some kind of conspiracy in them. And one of my favorite of his films that I watched on my birthday this year is called Céline and Julie Go Boating, which is about this woman who is sitting in the park one day when a magician runs past her and drops her scarf. So she tries to return it, and these two women sort of end up bonding together, and they discover this haunted house that's trapped in the past. And so both of them try and go into this house, and they end up caught in these horrible, tragic circumstances and then are spat out again afterwards. And then they eventually realize that it's up to them to sort of actively enter into the past under their own control and change what happened there and rescue this girl. It's very dramatic. It's hilarious. It's queer as hell. It's an amazing film. Funny. God, I just love it so much. But the way it ends is, well, they actually go boating. And then it's reversed. Now the magician sees the girl from the beginning walk by and drop her scarf and goes to pick it up and chase her down. So we've just come out the other side. So with the cinema books, we started off, what is cinema? What are our concepts? What does it do? And we did philosophy to try and explain cinema. And now at the end, what is philosophy?
Right.
Let's go chase that down and see what happens.
And do we need to revert to cinema to understand that now?
Its concepts will help.
Well, shit.
Yeah, and that's the cinema books.
I think that was a pretty good way to conclude that.
I like a big finish.
That was a big finish. Yeah. Anything else?
Oh my gosh, I'll plug my stuff one more time.
Yeah.
At Thought and Cinema on Twitter, THOT. At Cello Burke, cello like the instrument, BURKE on Instagram. I'm blocked, but send me a request. I'll let you in. It'll be fine. You can look at pictures of my parents' cat, and I don't know, maybe I'll put a selfie on there occasionally, but those are all on Twitter. Just follow me on Twitter.
And I'll link those in the descriptions. So
yeah, and God, who knows? I think my syneroticism essay might end up getting published in the Film Studies Journal of Canada, the Canadian Journal of Film and Media Studies. That's what it's called. Yeah, so if you're interested, if you follow me on Twitter, I'll link to that when it's available. And
yeah, whenever it's available, I'll put it on these episodes in the last movement image ones.
Yeah,
I can add that.
So yeah, if people want to check out my work, it's not necessarily as flashy as this stuff, but it's similar. I write about films and sort of aesthetics of indiscernibility, and a little bit of transfeminism sprinkled in, just for good measure. Yeah, this was fun.
I'm more appreciative that you came and explained this stuff to me than it was probably fun for you. But yeah, for those that made it this far, thank you for listening, and tune in next week for whatever else I have coming down the pipes. Take care.